Research shows that 25 to 40% of individuals with ADHD also have dyslexia. And that's why I invited my dear friend Elizabeth Hipwell to come on to the Busy Brain Saint today to talk to us about dyslexia. Elizabeth Hipwell is an educator and dyslexia interventionist with over 25 years of experience in supporting learners from preschool through college. Elizabeth understands this connection not just professionally but personally. As someone with ADHD and dyslexia, and a parent to 2 children with ADHD, she brings both lived experience and clinical insight into her work. Elizabeth is dedicated to helping students build skills and confidence through compassionate, individualized support. She also partners with parents and educators, offering practical, effective strategies to better support learners with attention and language-based differences. On a personal note, Elizabeth also was the person who helped me understand that I am mildly dyslexic, and she has really given me another key piece to my own puzzle, and I'm so excited to bring her on today. Enjoy this podcast. Heyo, Busy Brain. Welcome to the Busy Brained Saint podcast, where faith meets focus. I'm Camden Hainsworth, an expert ADHD coach, here to help you understand your mind with confidence. God knows your brain perfectly, so let's explore that divine design together and discover just how fulfilling your life can be, living with God and ADHD. Hey, ADHDer, I'm so grateful that you have chosen this podcast today. Thanks for being here. You've probably had these moments in your life where the same ADHD situation continuously creeps up. And no matter how many different angles you go about trying to conquer this symptom or this struggle, it just seems to be failure time and time again. Sometimes what you just need is a second view, a different view, a non-biased view. There's a really common phrase in the coaching world that says you can't see the outside of the label from inside of the bottle. And that's precisely what ADHD coaching does, is it allows me, as somebody who understands the ADHD brain, who's really got an attuned ear to help people, I can listen to your situation, listen to your struggle, and hear it in a different way. And I'd love to be able to do that for you. I have 20-minute free coaching sessions. I call them my mini sessions. And if you don't know if a whole coaching package is exactly what you want to sign up for, or if you are interested in learning more about my coaching, these free mini sessions are there for you. So highly recommend CamdenADHDcoaching.com, and you'll click on mini session, and then we can get together. And just in that 20 minutes or so, I promise I'm going to send you a whole different perspective on how to approach this. I know that I've at least helped you in some way to get a hold of yourself with ADHD. So once again, CamdenADHDcoaching.com, click on free mini session, and I hope to see you very, very soon. Now back into the podcast. Hello, you made it. I'm so happy that you are here. My brain is busy and my heart is full. Today's podcast episode is with a dear friend and an incredibly professional genius of dyslexia. This is my friend Elizabeth Hipwell, and we have known each other for 8 years now. Something like that. We're going to say 8, 7, 6.
I think 6.
That's 6 years. It feels like a delicious 8.
Perfect.
Elizabeth is a dyslexia coach and specialist, and she'll tell you all about what her certifications are, but I've probably already told you a little bit about that in the bio as well. And Elizabeth, I'm so glad that we get to talk today. Thanks for being on.
Thanks for having me. I'm so excited. Camden is one of my heroes. So it's just very great to be here. So I actually am a certified structured literacy dyslexia interventionist, also certified in Orton-Gillingham. I'm an Ohio State certified intervention specialist as well. And I get to do what I love every day and work with kiddos, helping them learn to read and write and do all the things and build confidence. And I also love to support adults just in, getting the information out there so that people can understand, because, right, I didn't know I had dyslexia until I was like 40. So
Yeah. What has that done for you? What was figuring out your own dyslexia? How did that change your own understanding of self and maybe propel you further into your work?
So what's really interesting is, for the longest time, I just thought everything took longer and I had to try harder and maybe I wasn't as smart, and that's just who I was, and I was okay with that to a degree. But then when I
Mhm.
started moving from just generalized working with kids with learning disability and I really got into the field of dyslexia specifically, I started to, for like a year, I was like, boy, some things are similar. And then I went to a week-long training on screening for dyslexia. And the first half of the day was all about like what a childhood looked like. And at one point I finally was like, oh my goodness, that's me. I'm dyslexic too. Like I hadn't connected it even though I'd been doing all of this.
Oh,
And that
yeah.
really changed everything. I no longer felt stupid. I mean,
Yeah.
there are things, right? We have our weaknesses, but that piece is like, oh, you're not stupid. You're not stupid. There is a reason that spelling is tricky. There's a reason things take longer. And it just really put a lot of things into perspective. And it changed who I was as a professional, interacting with my students, interacting with their parents. And it really helps like form a connection with my kiddos too.
Yeah, I'm sure. I mean, it's one thing to understand dyslexia and have empathy. It's another thing like you've lived it yourself. And both have their place and one's not better than the other. And there is a certain perspective that comes from somebody that can sometimes maybe even dig into their own like bag of tricks to say, what would I do? Or what kind of other situation, you have to go, you can go into your own experience in order to support your kids. And then you realized from a very, kind human that you probably have ADHD too. Uh,
I
a
did
little bit
realize it
later.
very I did, and that explained the rest of it, right? I had this
Yeah.
part of me that so much of me that was explained by the dyslexia piece. And things like a perfect example is I remember when I worked at Penn State, I remember having this conversation with a supervisor and it was a conversation my aunt happened to work in the same office and nepotism got brought up. And I remember having this conversation, I remember faking it and being like, because I didn't, and he looked at me and he knew, and he goes, "You don't even know what nepotism means." And I go, "No." And like one of my
Yeah.
areas of weakness is vocabulary. And I was like appalled.
Hmm.
And it was fine. It wasn't, he didn't think less of me, but I thought less of me. And with that same supervisor, when I first applied, I sent my cover letter. I found later after it was sent, after I'd interviewed, even after I've gotten the job, I found that I had misspelled your. I had used the wrong "your" on my letter, and it was like those things you could just go in a loop over, and you just feel like, "Oh my gosh." Luckily, this was a person who saw past those little bits and pieces, and,
Yeah.
the ADHD piece of me, that's why I looped about those things, right?
Yes.
Now, I do things and I'm like, "Oh, that's such a dyslexic brain." That's
Yeah.
such a thing, like, I think I put on my Instagram a long time ago about the whole toiletries. I made a list to pack and I had written toiletries down, right? And then I came back to it the next day and I had written toilet and trees, two separate words, and it's like
Your
I could
brain
laugh at
knew.
that. Right. And
Yeah.
right before I knew it was dyslexia, I would just have been like, oh. But anyway,
Yeah. Like
so that's
this is
me.
something that makes me a worse human or not as valuable person or
Right.
yeah, not a smart person. Yeah, that's awesome. And I think the more understanding we have of ourselves, the more grace and understanding we can give to not only ourselves but to other people as well. We don't always
Absolutely.
know what we're all navigating in life. So, okay,
Right.
let's just start out here. Let's say we all have our misconceptions or our understanding or fake understanding of what we think dyslexia is. So, let's just start there. What is dyslexia?
So dyslexia is characterized by a difference in the way our brain is organized. So the areas that process language, spoken, written, and like auditory language, right? It's an organization difference. So let's say wiring. So for example, like when we are born, we are wired for speech only. We are not wired for reading anything in text or writing. That's not where the wiring is. So someone who has a typical reading brain and not a dyslexic reading brain, those pathways, and basically there's three areas of the brain, and the pathways have to be developed, the neural pathways or the wiring. And so what happens is a typical reader, it will just happen, those pathways will form. But someone who has a dyslexic brain, the pathways don't automatically form, or they're weak, or they're a different route, or they're just not put together, which means that the three areas of the brain that process everything needed for reading and writing, those areas are less active, or one area is more active than another. So it really just comes down to a wiring issue if you're talking about the brain. So a specific definition would be, it's that it's a brain-based neurological, so it's neurological, it's brain-based.
Hmm.
It impacts reading, writing, spoken language, comprehension, those kinds of things. And it happens despite good classroom instruction.
Yeah.
So, and a bigger piece too, or not bigger, just an important piece, it's on a continuum. So we have people on the mild end of dyslexia clear to severe. And that's where people like me, people like you, that's where our dyslexia comes in and nobody ever noticed because we weren't doing poorly enough. We weren't
Yeah.
getting in trouble. We could do okay. And right, okay is great, but
Hmm.
we maybe could have had more instruction, better instruction, that kind of thing. So that's how we get to be adults without anybody recognizing that there's something going on,
Yeah. And it
if
wasn't
that
until I
makes
talked
sense.
to you and you brought me through like my own little, what would you call it? Evaluation or whatnot, that I was like able to point to very particular, honest dyslexic points of me. And, you said you're mildly dyslexic. That was really helpful. There's been people I brought onto this podcast and we talked about like um, their challenges in school. And I'm like, that sounds like dyslexia to me. Like you need to speak with my friend Elizabeth. So there are some crossovers between ADHD and dyslexia. I mean, we could jump there. I think the thing that maybe before we jump there that I want to point out is you didn't say, oh, it's just that letters get flipped around in someone's brain, right?
Right.
Um,
Right. And
it,
that is really a big misconception. I'm sorry I cut you off.
No, not at all.
But
I just remember you told me something about the way that I would see something on the board and then try and write it down and what intense, like how difficult that was. And part of it is probably ADHD executive function, but there's also this dyslexic part that I had never considered before.
right.
I remember being in fourth grade and my teacher telling me, I was skipping words and I could never remember what I had read ever. And I had worked and worked and worked and worked at it and it still was not working. And,
Right.
her saying, no wonder your comprehension's so bad, Camden, you're skipping all the words, right? And I was like, I was a very good student. I kept showing up, but there was this piece that just people weren't catching. They couldn't quite figure out. And because they could scoot me along compared to the other kids, I scooted along. Reading really long texts in college was just so bad. And sometimes it really had nothing to do with the attention. Other times it did, but just like it wouldn't stick. And
Right.
so there dyslexia is working on so many different areas of our brain that
Right.
maybe we don't even know.
Right. And that misconception of flipping letters. So here's the thing. Up until the end of first grade, it's very appropriate for a student to like confuse a B and a D. That's
Yeah.
typical development because children go from learning in a world where if you hold a chair up, if you hold something up, it's still that way whenever you turn it. If the chair is upside down, it's still a chair. But all of a sudden we get into print, and if you have a B and you turn it another way, it is now a D. It
Mm,
is not the same thing. And so
it's
that's
not
a common
3D.
thing,
Oh,
right? It's a common thing.
okay.
It's when that persists beyond that can then be a sign, or we write, something that is true is like a student may write the letters in the wrong order, or like
Hmm.
tack instead of cat, right?
Mm,
And sometimes when they're speaking or reading, they might read, if it's a two-syllable word, they might do the second syllable first, and so that it's
hmm.
like
Hmm.
mid-add or in, those kinds. I mean,
Hmm.
there's a lot of things, but like if you're just thinking in general, but it's not just, oh, it's just letter slipping, because people are still saying that, and and you see it all the time that, oh yeah, it's just this. Oh, it's just phonics, and it's not just phonics. It's not just that piece. That is one piece of the whole picture. It's called Scarborough's reading rope, and it really
Hmm.
explains how all the pieces fit together. How the comprehension and the decoding and all of those, go together to get the whole package. And if any area of that's weak, then you are not going to be a reader that can comprehend. So
Mm.
that makes sense.
So in your not coaching, in your teaching, there's probably a variety of areas that you're pushing on within that rope, or kind of what you
Right,
said.
right.
And so can you just take us to maybe one or two additional ones that you might coach on so that maybe we can conceptualize this a little bit better to take it outside of the scope of the flipped chair B and D situation?
Right. So when I have a student that when I start working with a student, what we're looking at is we're looking at the pieces. And so we start at the most basic level with like phonemic awareness. How does this individual hear the sound? Do they hear the separate sounds? Can they identify that a word has three sounds or a word has, two syllables and that kind of thing? And you start at the most basic level. Instruction for students with dyslexia is it's systematic, it's explicit, and it
Yeah.
is intensive. And then the students need, the most severe students need the most intensive, the most repetition. Someone
Yeah.
who might be more on the mild end, they maybe need that. They all need the explicit instruction, but they maybe don't need as intense of practice. But so, you would work through, we always, each lesson is you work on some of the listening where you're determining, can you change the sound in cat? Can you, say cat, right?
Mm-hmm.
Change the k to b, and they need to be able to go bat because that is directly connected to spelling. So that's a piece of it.
Yes.
We look at
Okay.
each individual letters and the sounds, and we go like our scope and sequence is very, you start with, the basic letters and short vowels, and then learn one syllable words, and then you move on, and each thing is explicitly introduced so that, like, at some point we're going to learn that a C can spell the k sound and also can spell the s sound, right? And and what are the conditions for that, right? A C will spell the s sound when it's followed by an E, I, or Y, right? And that's the explicit instruction. Where lots of people that just they learn to read, they may be introduced to that, or maybe they just pick it up and it's just an automatic thing. But our kiddos need that explicit instruction. So
Okay.
say someone like me who did not have that, my piece is really the spelling. I do love to read. I didn't know until I was, had kids and they started reading Harry Potter really fast that I was a slow reader, right?
Mm.
But the spelling piece has always been there. Like I've always had issues with spelling and I use my tools, right? I always use my tools. But maybe had someone done that explicit instruction, then I wouldn't struggle to spell the way that I
Oh,
do.
that
And
would be me a
because I
thousand percent.
yeah, and
I
because
couldn't
I
tell you
teach it.
any rules. Yeah.
Right. Well, because they did not teach that. And this movement
Mm-hmm.
of the science of reading right now that is amazing, that is trying to get this into classrooms, this is going to make the difference. It's going to pick up those kids that are on the mild end. Those severe kids are still always going to need intensive intervention. You can't combat this in a classroom. And there's
Mm-mm.
a out of Nancy Young out of Canada has this ladder of reading and writing, and it's wonderful, and it looks at students in a classroom and it shows each rung of the ladder. It has the bottom is those severe kids. It's like 10% of kids in a classroom, and those kids are going to be dyslexic. They're going to need the severe explicit, not severe, excuse me, sequential explicit instruction, right? And then the next group, they need the explicit instruction, but they maybe don't need the repetition that that first group needs. And then you
Yeah.
go a little higher, and maybe a kid, the reading part isn't difficult, but they need that explicit instruction in spelling. And then the top of this is going to be the kids that don't need anything, and actually we need to learn to teach up for them, right? So that's kind of like the picture of the classroom and how
Okay.
kids can be missed, if that makes sense. And
Yeah.
I'm going to circle back because you were asking like what about a lesson. So as we teach those explicit rules, we look at, students look at words in isolation, they look at words in sentences, and they look at words in text. They read in text, which is decodable to whatever skill they're on. And then once they master that skill, then we keep on building and building until they get to where they need, but it's just one
Okay.
step at a time. And right, if in order to comprehend, we have to have appropriate fluency. And fluency is that ability to read and in a conversational, where you sound conversational while you read, you're
Yeah.
not stumbling around, you're not slowing down. But if you cannot read fluently, that is a decoding problem, meaning that you have to sound the words out. You don't have the automaticity to get
Yeah.
through the sentence. So that means so we could say, oh yeah, you have a comprehension problem, but you have to look deeper and you can pinpoint if a student has had some good instruction and it's a fluency issue. Okay, then you have to back up. All right, what's the piece, right? And that's kind of like when
Yeah.
you get an older
Interesting.
student, you look at it that way, but if that makes
Cool.
sense.
It does. Yeah. And I remember at some point I decided, fine, I want to get really good and really fluid at reading aloud. And I think it was in Sunday school. We would read like scripture and I would read aloud and I could compare it to my highly intelligent good friend at that time. Her name was Kelly. And she just like she was very, very just naturally gifted with her book smarts, I guess you could say. And I was like, I'm going to be that. And so pure determination, and I would practice aloud over and over again to get familiarized with scripture words so that when I saw them, I didn't have to sound them out anymore. Like, so I was like this repetitiveness on purpose so that when verses would come up, I could raise my hand. I was such a teacher's pet. Just, that was my reward, right? That was my dopamine. And I was like, I will be someone that can read aloud well. And that helped me a lot as a sixth grade teacher as well. And I think that I've improved. But still, when I have my whiteboard when I'm coaching and I have to write out an emotion that I have not written out like for years, I don't have any tools. I have no idea what tools to tap into to write that word. And so I go, I'm so sorry. I don't know how to spell it. Do you know how to spell it? And, hopefully with my time and my development, that might be something that I can develop. But it truly does impact me now as a professional. Not knowing how to spell a word does not equate to my intelligence. And yet it comes up still so often that publicly with a client who's paying me to help them with their ADHD, my dyslexia, and what would you say, my undiagnosed dyslexia, and the fact that I haven't actually done something about it yet is very much on display. And so if you're in this ADHD world, people, and you might be experiencing some things similar to this, it might be really interesting to either get an evaluation or to read a little bit more about it or develop some skills right along with me, to improve in this area. And I think that's where we can shift into that, Elizabeth, and talk about maybe what some of the crossovers are and how maybe you can even like tap into yourself and see how can you determine if this is part of your dyslexia or ADHD, or, it might be a little bit difficult to know.
So here's kind of the thing that jumped out at me as I was kind of doing some review, and there are many dyslexia experts who know lots more than me, so I'm just
Yeah, but
bringing
you're
me to
my
the table,
favorite.
right?
You're my favorite. Yes.
Thank
And you
you.
are quite the
And
expert. You don't give yourself enough credit. My goodness.
um, so here's the thing about dyslexia, right? We said it is a brain organization, right, thing. And
Yeah.
ADHD is really the difference in how the brain regulates the attention, the activity, and the impulsive behaviors. Both of those impact the executive functions, right? So
Yes.
that is a
Okay.
huge thing. So there are pieces, right? Even as I was learning, so in my household, there is an undiagnosed adult, my husband, who has ADHD, who when I first started learning about dyslexia, I was like, "Oh, he must have dyslexia. He fits all these pieces." Some of the pieces, right? That's before I knew a lot. And then then we had my son, and I'm like, "Oh my goodness, this little guy has ADHD." And he does. He has severe inattentive type ADHD. And that's when I looked at my husband, I'm like, "Oh, that's the piece. It's not dyslexia," right? He didn't have the pieces of the reading. Like he is a slow reader, but it's about his attention.
Yeah.
And then so we've, supported my son and with it. And but as I work with my students and I work with my son, it's a lot of those same pieces, the following directions, the, guiding them, getting using a map, like directions, like trying to get somewhere, navigating things. Now, don't be confused because there are people that are really good at that who are dyslexic, who are or have ADHD.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
I have a 10th grade student who has been with me since she was in 5th grade, was a total non-reader, and her vocabulary is far surpassing mine. So like
Wow.
there are the strengths are different. Like one of mine is a weak vocabulary and hers is strong, but she can use a map better than I can, and that kind of
Mm-hmm.
thing. So when we look at executive function, so sorry, I jump around,
You're
but
great.
the
We
all
love it.
these pieces, right? I don't know if you're familiar with Tara Sumter, who's an SLP who specializes in executive function. She thinks about executive function as the boss of the brain, right? And that's probably how you describe it as well, or
Mm-hmm.
the conductor of the orchestra. So the same things that our ADHDers struggle with in those areas and trying to, perceive things, the attention, the verbal working memory, the nonverbal working memory, and the inhibition abilities, that is all impacted by dyslexia. It does not look the same, right? It
Okay.
doesn't look the same, but there is that overlap. So statistically, if we talk about heritability, right? We know that, these things run in families.
Yeah.
So dyslexia, 40, so sorry, my numbers, sorry, I have to look at my numbers because my recall for facts can be
No, who
weak,
would
and
have
that's
this?
okay.
No, it's great. It's
There are lots
perfect.
of people, and that is okay. I can recognize the areas, right? So heritability, dyslexia, 40 to 60% of people with dyslexia, it runs in their families. In
Wow.
ADHD, 77 to 88%
Wow.
runs in families. The
Okay.
comorbidity piece between ADHD and dyslexia is 25 to 40% of people with ADHD also have dyslexia, and
Okay.
some reports show as high as 45%.
Okay.
So, right?
Yeah, that's
So,
high. That's really high.
yeah, it's
Mm-hmm.
very
A little bit
high.
less than
And
half. Yeah.
right. And
A quarter to half.
both
Mm-hmm.
yeah, both the dyslexia and the ADHD, right? It's not related to intelligence. That's such a huge thing. We know that with ADHD, we know that with dyslexia, but not everybody knows that. And that is
Yeah.
a huge message, right? And you even when you described your very highly intelligent friend Kelly,
Yeah.
you put her in a box different than you.
Intelligent. I heard myself say that.
Yeah, and we don't know
Yeah.
that, and
Yeah.
I always said about my brother, I felt like he could hold a book to his head, and my mom was the same way, and they would just know it, and I felt like I
Yeah.
was over and over and over, and
Yeah.
it's just it's the wiring, it's not the intelligence. So that's kind of,
Mm-hmm.
that's a pretty important to me, that's an overlap in the
Yeah.
ADHD and dyslexia that
So like you would have, let's say, for example, I have a variety of tasks to do, let's say as a mom, or I have a variety of homework assignments to do as a student. And the dyslexia would and the result in both of these either of these situations is that things aren't getting done. I'm feeling stuck. I'm feeling like I can't get into motion to start onto this list. And as an ADHD coach, I would say, okay, we need to get into clarity because you're in overwhelm, you're flooded with overwhelm. So let's write down, instead, let's take it out of your head and let's write it down on a list. And let's see if anything is time sensitive. Does anything need to be done today or tomorrow? And we're going to circle that, and that's where we're going to begin. And so that's where the ADHD might push on it. The dyslexia might push on the same result of not being able to get started, but it might push on it a different way. And maybe that might have to do with just how it's organized in the brain, or maybe they have written it down, but I don't know, maybe you can give some insight on that. But essentially, it's pushing on two different things, but the result looks the same, coming out with executive dysfunction. Is that
right. So
okay?
I would say that same piece, right? That same piece of, okay, what do I need to do? Making the plan, right? We're going to make the
Yeah.
plan. And then the dyslexic maybe has to go a little further. What are the tools that I'm going to need different for the plan, right? Am I going to need
Mm.
this on audio? Am I going to
Mm-hmm.
need someone to reread these directions to me because I truly cannot comprehend them? Not that I can't focus on them. Am I going to
Yeah.
write, right? What's the writing going to look like? And so wait, like there are multiple so many steps, executive function requirements to write anything, to write a paragraph, to write a sentence. You're looking at multiple things. So the ADHD or the strictly ADHD, right, is looking
Mm-hmm.
at getting through those, keeping the attention, all that stuff. We add the dyslexia piece, and it's like, okay, what are my tools? How am I going to check my spelling? Am I going to, the fact that I can't spell that, is that going to stop me from moving, from even going any further, right? And it's those
Yeah.
tools. So you're
Okay.
you're you're implementing the tools, that speech to text, text to speech, where
Mm-hmm.
a lot of times, and these are things a lot of things that I started to do before I knew I had dyslexia, is I
Yeah.
will have my computer
Oof.
read to me whatever I write, because our
Yeah.
very smart brains, our very intelligent brains, we write things, and then when we read them back to ourselves, our brain fills in all the words we didn't put in, that we missed. And then you send
you've
the
you've
email,
caught me
and then
multiple times on that one.
and and then you
Yes.
send the email, and you're like, and then you read it and you're like, oh great, I forgot 4 words or a word, or I misspelled, like,
Yeah.
so it's that kind of thing.
Yeah.
Prior
Okay.
to all the tech, I remember when I had a Mac classic computer my freshman year.
Uh-huh.
Actually, I had a typewriter my freshman year of college, and I used to print out my stuff, I'd type out my stuff, and then I would read from the bottom because I'm pretty good at recognizing my spelling errors, like,
Wow.
after the fact, but I would read backwards from the bottom, like, just look at words individually because I knew, and this before I knew anything, it was just like my instinct
Oh
to,
my
like,
goodness.
catch my spelling errors because I knew I wouldn't see them going forward, if that
If
makes
it was
sense.
a, yeah, it
Yeah,
does. Mm-hmm.
there's a lot of, and that's kind of like, we do talk about our having gifts and having, I don't like to say superpower because I don't think dyslexia is my superpower, ADHD is my superpower. That's just me. I think that getting
Mm-hmm.
around the things that we have trouble with, that's the actual superpower. But
Yeah.
I have an ability, like, one of my gifts is that I, even when I was working with students and I would look at how they were doing something, and I can modify really easily. And I realize now how many modifications and accommodations I made for myself going through school, that I just
Yeah.
automatically did because I knew I needed it. And some of our adults don't see what they need to do. They don't automatically see that. So, but they might be an amazing artist, or, think with an engineering brain and that kind of things, that out of the
Yeah.
box thinking. So, some days I joke and I say, wow, I don't have this, I don't have that, but you know what? I have this other thing, but, like,
Yeah.
don't we all want the grandeur, the art piece, the music piece, the, you know,
Yeah. The applause, what the applause, comes from. I love Ted Lasso. Have you ever seen Ted? Oh no,
yes,
not Ted Lasso. I do love that. I don't know why I said that. Will Trent. I said that because I have dyslexia. What's a
exactly.
show with
Name
two
finding, word
names?
finding, right. Exactly.
So
That
versus
is
Will Trent.
exactly a piece. That is a symptom. That is a symptom
And
of
my
behavior of.
yeah, my brother has always laughed. Evidently, that is actually a specific diagnosis. I don't know what it's called, where you do meaning making, right? Something like that. Like your brain remembers it by meaning and less by actually what it is. Anyway, very funny. So, Will Trent is a great show. He's an investigator and he has dyslexia. And so he puts all
Right.
of his stuff on his little recorder. And, I know that that's not actually like a real thing, but to speak to the highly intelligent, right? This highly intelligent human that happens to have a difference in how his brain understands letters and words and etc. So
And he
that's pretty
uses the
cool.
tool. He uses a
Yeah,
tool that
he
he,
does.
and that's the thing, and use the tools. And, there's a whole, I've seen so many debates over audiobooks. I've seen it where I've seen online in book clubs of just typical
Yeah.
book clubs, and, oh, it's cheating. And it's like, and I mean, I wrote a blog post once about, it's not cheating. Our brain, when it is hearing language, the same parts of the brains is being used, and
Yeah.
listening does a couple of things. It gives us the ability to comprehend because we're not so focused
Yes,
on
that's
the
me.
work needed
Hmm.
to read, right? It allows us to build our vocabulary because certainly if you think of a student or even an adult, if I can only read at a certain level, then I am limited. But if I can listen at a much higher level, then I've opened up my world. I've opened up the
Hmm.
vocabulary. It really does, improve comprehension, and it lets a student think. But yeah, there's a lot of debate, and and the other piece that we need to look at for anyone is that using the audio, everybody else uses it for convenience. Oh, I'm going to listen to a book while I'm at the gym. Well,
Yeah.
is that cheating? No,
Right.
so there's a
Yeah.
lot of and it's just it becomes an interesting debate. So many
Yeah.
things, and I remember, 30 years ago when I first taught people, oh, it's not fair if they get this accommodation. Well, it's
It's
fair
not
as getting what
fair
you
that they have
need.
that kind of brain and that kind of brain. Like, what's
Right.
fair even mean, right?
Fair means each person gets what they need to do the
Right.
same, to achieve the same. That's the thing.
Yeah.
So it's like,
Thank you.
and I've had parents say about something, and I said, "Well, can you see without your glasses?" Yeah, yeah, I mean, it's
Right.
the same, like
Yeah.
if that's the thing. And I have, some students and they have IEPs and, they can if they're allowed to have audio, they can answer comprehension questions at grade level. They can do a lot at grade level, but if they are required to read, they can't do it at grade level.
Wow.
So, and
Interesting.
yeah, and there's a certain point, there's a certain space where when do we if we have a kiddo who has struggled all along, when do we decide? I mean, we always want to provide intervention, but we also have to be realistic with how does our society work and what are the
Yeah.
tools we have. We also need to concentrate on using those tools. So any adult that goes, "Oh my goodness, I think I'm dyslexic," we can look at diagnosis, right? We have screenings that can just kind of be, do you fit the profile of someone who might have dyslexia? You can, like the
Mhm.
International Dyslexia Association has a screener. There's multiple ones that you can do self screeners. Sometimes that's enough, right? For me, I didn't want to go get a diagnosis because here's the thing, I'm going to test well. I'm going to test
Yeah.
well. It's going to
'Cause you
be
have
really based on
skills.
my history, right? I have
Yeah.
all these skills. And most
Uh-huh.
adults have a lot of good coping skills, especially professional adults.
Yeah.
So there's that piece. But if you're an adult and you're in college, heading to college, or you're in a work environment that you have a job you love, but it's so hard to get your work done, that's when you would like when an official clinical diagnosis would be important because
Yeah.
then you've got the documentation to show that you are someone who would benefit from accommodations. And that's an ADA thing. That's Americans with Disability Act,
Mhm.
giving access, equal access. So that's kind of important thing. And like when I worked at Penn State, I was a disability services coordinator and the students would come in,
Mm.
and some students would come out of school and they'd have an IEP or a 504 plan and they would get accommodations for the same accommodations they
Mm.
received in high school. Extended test time, audio, all of those things, text to speech, speech to text, all of those things. There's many more. And then we would also get the kids that would come in, the students that would come in and say, I never had this much trouble before. I can't keep up with the reading. And then we would refer them and it would be discovered that they had dyslexia. And so then they would bring their documentation in and then they too could now be, able to use the accommodations. We had a doctor across the street who came, and I live in Cleveland, and so we have like
Mhm.
Cleveland Clinic and all that. So he was here to do a fellowship, and we got talking about dyslexia. And he said, I had like multiple people in my, medical school who that's when they
Wow.
got their diagnosis. So these were high achieving
That's
folks
great.
that's when they got so
Oh my
it's
gosh.
anybody, right? So that's
Amazing. Yeah, I think back to like my science courses. Well, even more close to home is as my daughter, she really struggles with writing, and it was frustrating for me to see her grades going down because she wasn't struggling. I gave her oral exams. So like I would say, "Okay, tell me about what you read or tell me what you know about this." And she was able to like talk it out and I would write it down for her, right? And but because that was so difficult, it required so much of her executive function and whether it's dyslexia or not, but I think it speaks to the issue here is that they were grading her actually on her writing ability. They weren't even though they said they weren't, but that's what they were grading her on instead of on her actual knowledge. And so an IEP at 504 can, depending on, whatever it is, can give people access to show their information, to show what their knowledge without having to hurdle this every single time. Now, if she's in a writing class, okay, like that's actually about, okay, we need to form sentences and stuff. Or a handwriting class, I guess we could say. Yeah, let's really focus in. Let's get this skill. And of course, there's going to be accommodations for that. But now we're actually grading about that, like we're actually testing the skill that's being tested. So just as parents thinking about that there might be some hurdles that are harming kids with reading, with writing, with whatever it might be that really have nothing to do with the subject matter. And then I was thinking about my college courses and how I was pre-dental for a while. And the hardest part wasn't about the learning, or even the application. I understood the systems of the body. I understood the chemistry and the biology. It was very fun. It was kind of like a big art project. I could see it working together. But the way that they wanted me to explain that was so rigid and finding the words and finding the exact technical terms and committing those to memory was so difficult for me. And I wonder how interesting if that was touching on a piece of dyslexia or ADHD as diagnosed in both. What difference would that have made for these courses I really, really loved and actually could have brought a great deal of enthusiasm to if I was asked to present the information in a way that, and with the right tools that made sense for how my brain was organized. It's a whole world that opens up to you when you know how to advocate for yourself.
Exactly. And that's the thing, I remember when I freshman year of college and I came home with a C in his American history. And my dad is dyslexic, severely dyslexic, undiagnosed.
Mm-hmm.
And now I'm like, oh my goodness, because he can't, there's a lot of things he can't do, but he is like an amazing welder. He builds beautiful railings, all of these things.
Mm-hmm.
But he says to me, how could you get a C in history? And I go, because it was all essays. And then I said, let me
Mm.
tell you what I learned. And the whole ride back from college, the whole ride, back home for whatever break it was, I told him what I learned. And I said, I learned things that I didn't learn in high school. And it was amazing. And I was fascinated. But yeah, I got a C because it was an essay. It was essay and
Yeah.
handwritten. And if we could, and that's the thing, we want to measure. What are we measuring? Are we measuring output? Are we measuring, output, or are we measuring spelling? Because if I'm measuring and if I want to see what a student, what kind of composition they can come up with, can you write a paragraph, a summary on this article that you just read, right? We're
Yeah.
going to teach them the tools explicitly. I am not going to penalize spelling. Right? I'm
Yeah.
going to take them through and show them how to look at that. But if I'm looking at content, did they understand what they read and could they show it to me in writing? That's the
Mm-hmm.
measure, right? Yeah. Do we want all
Yes.
of those pieces?
Of
Absolutely.
course.
But we
Mm-hmm.
have to start, somewhere. And that kind of,
Yeah.
I was just going to jump back to, so here's the thing. As an adult, a lot of kids that get the dyslexia diagnosis, that this happens with the ADHD too, right? We hear the stories of like mom tried the medicine because they
Yeah.
wondered, right? And that's how my son told me for years, you have ADHD, mom, and you were like, hey, you seem like someone who might. And it still took me years to go and
Yeah.
the bravery of it. But same thing happens with dyslexia. We have a lot of adults whose child gets diagnosed and they go, oh my goodness, this is me. My child is much more severe, but this is me. And that's how they find out. And so when advocating for our kiddos, right, there's a couple things at play. A clinical diagnosis of dyslexia is different than eligibility. So if I take my kiddo and I say, okay, we're going to go to a neuropsychologist, or there are lots of amazing SLPs who also do diagnosis for dyslexia. Some psychologists do diagnosis, but what happens is you get that and you take it back to the school and you say, okay, my kid has dyslexia. And then the school says, oh, it's not bad enough. So, and because it's on the continuum, because if your kid is at the mild end, but they have a clinical diagnosis, that does not automatically mean that they can have eligibility under, IDEA, under the, special education law to get an IEP. So in those cases, I mean, we know more service would help, right? In those cases, they cannot get an individualized education plan, an IEP. Sometimes those kids can at least get a 504 plan. And the difference between those is the IEP provides specific individualized instruction. It also provides accommodations. The 504 plan will only provide the accommodations. So, where the IEP will have, okay, you're going to get explicit instruction in these things,
Mm-hmm.
and you can get extended time on your test, you can get accommodations. And a 504 is strictly the accommodations. It's strictly like, let's
Okay.
level the playing field. And that's good for a parent to know. So,
Yeah, a lot of people will ask me that too. So I'm really glad you brought that up in this context. This has been amazing. I think that I'm trying to think because, as adults, learning more information about ourselves helps us figure out. So maybe my one of these last questions would be, they've been listening to you, people listen to me, they're thinking, okay, either this is my kid or this might be me, and I'm already an adult and I'm grown and I'm maybe out of school. What would be the first steps in either of those situations? I think you just said neuropsychiatrist or SLP evaluation. to be clinically diagnosed might be the first one, but then bringing that to the resource team at the school. But if you could bring any further understanding that, and then what about adults? Like we're functioning well enough, but we want to improve on our holes, where things that were missed, and we want to improve that way. What could we do?
So most, if you're a student, if your child is in a public school, our hope is, and again, with the science of reading movement and the laws
Mm-hmm.
that are happening, there are a lot of new laws and there's a lot of implementation of the laws, but it's a slow process. Change in education is slow. But our hope is that a kiddo will be identified and taken through the RTI, process where, response to intervention, where they, get the intervention and then it's decided, okay, do we need to do an evaluation? So sometimes we can wait. Sometimes in schools, people will say, the educators will say to a parent, wait and see. We do not ever want to wait and see. If you have a gut feeling that there's something going on with your kid, go outside and go to, like I said, a speech pathologist, a psychologist, go and and really do your homework on, is this person well versed in dyslexia? Because I have worked with people who just don't have the information. And
What should we
dyslexia,
ask? What could we
like,
ask?
are you specialists in diagnosing dyslexia?
Okay.
I mean, you just like flat out ask, and a lot of
Mm-hmm.
them will, like, say what their areas are, because some psychologists, it's their area of expertise, like they could do it, but maybe their focus is autism
Mm-hmm.
diagnosis, or that kind of thing. And you also want to ask that question, if you suspect the ADHD overlap, can we look at my kid in all of these areas? Let's
Yeah.
look at all the pieces. So there is that. And if your child is not eligible for services in the school, say we get the diagnosis, they're not eligible for any services or that IEP, then it's up to you to go out and find it. Unfortunately, that's kind of
Mm-hmm.
what goes on. It's how it is. So what you want is, again, we've got a lot of certified Orton Gillingham specialists, therapists. You want to make sure that if they use a program like Wilson or Barton, that the person is certified in it, that they use it with fidelity. Orton Gillingham is the underlying methodology that those programs are based on, and Orton Gillingham is meant to be prescriptive and diagnostic, meaning we look at each individual kid and we do exactly what they need. We don't move forward until, we look at what do they need exactly, get that skill, keep on moving, right? And speech pathologists also, I mean, they have a lot of the language training. They're equipped, and many of them don't know. And that's kind of a movement right now, is the speech pathologists are learning, like, oh my goodness, I am equipped for this, and
Yeah.
they get, the additional information. So that's a way to get, so so you need to get the intervention outside of school if you cannot get it inside of school. And it
Mm-hmm.
needs to be intensive. There's not a quick fix for dyslexia.
Mm-hmm.
It's a long-term commitment. As far as for your child, it could be anywhere from, 18 to 36 months. It depends on the kid. And you want to make sure that whoever does it is certified and that they use the information and their knowledge with fidelity, meaning
Okay.
that they do the things, that they don't just pull from 12 programs and say, oh, we're going to try this today, and it's not
Mm-hmm.
a mashup, right? Even
Well,
though that there are professionals, and that's a good intention. So there's that.
it makes
It's
sense because you're looking for the holes, right? And you don't know where the holes are going to come up unless you've gone over each individual thing in process, right? Like that's really really important. They probably build upon each other too. And
absolutely
when we think about the brain, I keep thinking disconnected, but you talked about those three parts of the brain, just like that disconnection. We're trying to create some kind of connection now with that direct instruction that is going to make sense of it all.
right.
And
It's
reading
you're
chapter 1 to
creating,
chapter 8 isn't
right,
gonna do that.
right. Right, because we're looking for is we're building the neural pathways, or we're strengthening
Yes.
them if they're already there and they're weak, or we're building them entirely. We're routing them entirely. So that's why a kid can come in, and we can work together for an hour and then leave, and they're just like, their mom and dad's like, why are they so tired? Because they literally were wiring themselves today. Like, that's
Yeah.
brain work, and brain work is
Yes.
exhausting.
It is.
And making sure that our kids have then the support in the classroom, right? I
Hmm.
it's It's a lot, and unfortunately, it's just not an easy path. Some places it is an easy path to get your kid a
Mm,
diagnosis and do what they need, but sometimes it's not, and you got to trust your gut. And that is the piece where, as the parent, you've got to find the support online. And there's a ton of like online support on Instagram. There's a ton of that kind of stuff, and you need to find your people who can help
yeah.
you in that way. As far as adults looking for, you really have to, as an adult, what is the need, right? So for me, I have the education and I teach kids all day. There are still things that I have to look at the spelling on. And I always model that for my students. I'll say, you know what? I know and I teach this rule, but sometimes I'm not sure, and I model that. So if you just need to know, if you just want to be like, yeah, I'm pretty sure I have it. What do I need to do? And if that's something that like validates how you've been and explains things and makes you feel better, which I'm sure there's a much better way to say that, but if
No,
that's
it's
all you
great.
need, and you need tools and things, but you can read, you can do the things, then you have to find the tools that help you, right? And look for
Hmm.
those resources. If you're someone and it's severe and then you would want to be referred and you would want to find the same type of intervention for an adult.
Hmm.
And then those things can be strengthened. Now the thing that we know is, right, we can do all the intervention in the world. It doesn't mean you're cured. You still have dyslexia, but you've had intervention and you can do really well. But if you're tired, you're hungry, you're stressed out, some of those things still will be hard, or they'll be harder today than they will be tomorrow. And that is another like dyslexia piece, the inconsistency from day to day.
Yeah.
That's important to note. And I know I was just going to say, because we are talking to adults here, three people that I love on social media. There is Dr. Jacob Sandhouse. I think that maybe I've sent you some things. He is a counselor who specializes in dyslexia counseling and coaching, and he shares like the dyslexia experience. Like every time I watch his video, I'm like, oh, I almost share every single video on my Instagram, but I'm always like, oh yeah, like he
Hmm.
explains it so well and makes it okay. I don't even
Yeah.
know how else to
That's
say it. He
awesome.
makes you feel like supported. There is
Okay.
also a woman named Jo Reese, and she is a Dyslexia Life with Jo Reese, and she has a late diagnosis in ADHD. She's dyslexic. I think she had a late dyslexia diagnosis.
Hmm.
And she does coaching, and I think she does some group coaching. And also, to
Awesome.
back up to Dr. Jacob, he also is dyslexic. So that's kind of
Okay.
helpful. And then the third one is Natalie Brooks. She runs Dyslexia in Adults. I think that Kristen Carter on I Have
Hmm.
ADHD actually interviewed her.
Oh, awesome.
And I think she's out of the UK, and she has like a group coaching kind of membership thing. I think it's called The Hive, and she does a lot of support. And she had an early diagnosis in dyslexia, but a late ADHD diagnosis.
Okay.
So, and she really shares like her work experience and really gives tools to help an adult know where to go, what to do, and how to manage it,
Hmm.
right? And it's
Amazing.
confidence and everything like that. So, those are some places
And
that
we'll
I
be
love.
sure to, we can put that in the show
Yeah,
notes too. And I'll
of
have you send
course.
those to me, text those to me.
Sure.
That's awesome. Okay. Well, and that's a great place to start too as adults, is just to find your community, find people that are educating you more, and then they'll have some tools probably you can hop into, book recommendations, or, that's kind of ironic, podcast recommendations, whatever it might be, right? To help us out with that. Well, where can people find you, Elizabeth? Where do you want them to find you?
So I am on Instagram at the Dyslexia Digest. I also have a website that is the dyslexiadigest.com or elizabethhipwell.com. You can get there a variety of ways. And I always say that my mission is, right, I want to work with students and I want to help them, but my mission is to help anyone who is navigating dyslexia get to the resource they need, right? So that's like the
Perfect.
mission. Like if they reach out, I'm happy to talk to them and get them going in the right way.
Awesome. Sign up for her email list, guys, so that she can send you some fun things as they start to come out more. And just love you, Elizabeth. I'm so grateful that our paths have crossed. I'm grateful for your friendship and your expertise in this particular area. It's always very inspiring to hear you talk about it. So thanks for being with
Aw,
us today.
thanks for having me. You're
Yeah.
the best.
Thanks for tuning in to another episode of the Busy Brained Saint podcast. If you're eager to explore the world of ADHD coaching, make sure to connect with me on Instagram at Camden_ADHD or visit my website, CamdenADHDcoaching.com. For more LDS-specific ADHD content, don't forget to follow this podcast and join us on Instagram at The Busy Brained Saint. Listen, I'm here to support you on your journey. I cannot wait to have you as a part of our community. Stay engaged, stay inspired, and remember, you're not alone here. Thanks for being a part of the Busy Brained Saint family.